998, 999, 1,000.
Oh, hi. I didn't see you there. You've caught me at an odd moment. I was just finishing my daily workout. I'm afraid I'm not really ready to give any kind of presentation, but I'll see what comes to me. Gambling. Let's talk about it. Gambling. The very word brings to mind the ideas of glitz, glamour, crazy nights on the strip, big excitement, and bigger wins. But for as much as we romanticize gambling, a lot of us know that the odds aren't really in our favor. But even with that, gambling hasn't stopped, and casinos certainly aren't running out of customers. Have you ever stopped and asked yourself, why is that? Why do people keep choosing to gamble? A lot of us can probably think of some of the more obvious reasons. The big adrenaline rush that comes from betting big, taking that risk. Some people use gambling as a form of socializing. They'll go out for a night with friends, or they just enjoy competing with other people. Some people use gambling as a form of escapism. But the most obvious reason people gamble is for that big win, to get that jackpot. But if that's one of the biggest reasons people gamble, and the games are rigged in the house's favor, and most people know that before they even go in gambling, why do so many people still choose to gamble? In today's video, I'm going to cover two big reasons that people still choose to gamble: the gambler's fallacy and then operant conditioning. As a quick disclaimer, this video will be covering reasons people choose to gamble, which is very different from an addiction, which involves people losing the ability to choose. First, let's talk about the gambler's fallacy. To understand that, it's easiest to use an example. Let's say we're betting on this coin flip. Are your odds better if you bet that it'll land on heads or on tails? If you guess that you have the same odds either way, then you'd be right and you'd be agreed with most people. Now let's say I've already flipped this coin 3 times and it landed on heads every time. Now, are your odds better if you bet on heads or on tails? Most people think that your odds are better on tails because it'll start evening out to the overall 50-50 chance. But that's where the gambler's fallacy comes into play. Most people think of the probability of that question like this chart shows. They see that the odds of getting 4 heads in a row is 1 out of 16 possibilities. They may not do the exact math, but the brain gets the idea that there's less and less of a chance as it goes on. However, my question wasn't about getting 4 heads in a row. It was only about this last one flip. Will I get a heads or a tails on this one flip? And that is a 50-50 chance. The key phrase to understanding the gambler's fallacy is that past actions have no effect on future actions. And this applies mainly in games of chance where the odds are reset each time, like slot machines. People tend to think that if something goes off the deviated probability, for instance, if you had a large streak of heads, that soon after there would be a large streak of tails, or at least that your odds of getting tails grow with each head. We think that the universe will somehow right itself to even out that probability. But that's not true when the odds reset at the beginning of every single round. Every single flip, you have a 50-50 chance, regardless of what came before it. Now, let's talk about operant conditioning. This is something heavily led by the researcher B.F. Skinner, who was able to prove that you could condition volition in animals. What this means is that you could condition an animal to choose to do something. While researching operant conditioning, Skinner devised what was later named a Skinner box, a box that contained a pigeon and a button. Whenever the pigeon would peck the button, food would be released. After toying around with many variables and recording how those variables changed the amount of times the pigeon chose to peck that button, how those variables affected the pigeon's volition to peck that button. Skinner came up with a few discoveries, and those discoveries helped lay the groundwork for what we know about operant conditioning. The first discovery was that operant conditioning works on humans. The second was that a change in the reinforcement schedules can change how effective operant conditioning is. And the third discovery was that primary reinforcers work worse than secondary reinforcers once satiation is reached. Because the first point is pretty self-explanatory, I'm going to cut to explaining points 2 and 3. After countless experiments and tinkering with reinforcement schedules, Skinner was able to determine that there were several specific types of reinforcement schedules, and that those different schedules affected how well an operant was conditioned to perform a behavior. He determined that there were two main categories of reinforcement scheduling. Firstly, there's continuous reinforcement, which means that reinforcement is delivered every time the specific behavior is exhibited. Secondly, there's partial reinforcement, which is pretty much the opposite of continuous reinforcement, meaning that reinforcement is not given every single time the specific behavior is exhibited. Under partial reinforcement, there are 4 more subcategories. First, there's fixed ratio reinforcement, which means that the operant receives reinforcement after a specific amount of times they exhibit the behavior. Next, there's fixed time reinforcement, which means that the operant is reinforced after a specific amount of time passes. Next, there's variable ratio reinforcement, which means that the operant is reinforced after a random amount of times the operant exhibits the behavior. Finally, there's variable time ratio, which means that the operant is reinforced after a random amount of time passes. While continuous and fixed forms of reinforcement help in the early stages of conditioning to help show the operant the connection between performing a behavior and being reinforced, studies have shown that variable forms of reinforcement, especially variable ratio, have a higher resistance to extinction. Extinction is the likelihood that an operant will stop performing its behavior after it stops receiving reinforcement for that behavior. Out of the 4 partial reinforcement schedules, studies have shown that variable ratio reinforcement has shown the highest response rates and the highest resistance to extinction. Let's watch an example of this. Note the operant's high response rate as well as her resistance to extinction, the fact that she continues performing her behavior despite the reinforcement temporarily going away. In this test, the operant is being conditioned to say the brownie rewarder's name, Arya. She will be rewarded with a brownie on a variable ratio schedule. Let's see what happens. Let's watch some science.
Arya, 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 Arya.
Science.
Arya, 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 Arya.
Now, let's discuss the 2 types of reinforcers, primary reinforcers and secondary reinforcers. In terms of operant conditioning, a primary reinforcer is a biological need of an organism, something like food, sex, or water. On the other hand, a secondary reinforcer is something that is outside of the biological realm. However, it's often something that can help us get something that would fall in the primary reinforcer category. One of the best examples of this would be money, but others include such things as social affirmation. In terms of operant conditioning, both of these work as reinforcers, but it's been found that primary reinforcers eventually reach a point of satiation, which means an organism reaches its biological limit for taking in that primary reinforcer. Or after an operant reaches satiation, the effectiveness of the primary reinforcer begins to drop very quickly. Secondary reinforcers, however, have been found to have almost no satiation limit. Their effectiveness almost never begins to wane. Let's see an example of this. Let's try to condition two operants to clap their hands. We'll condition the first operant with a primary reinforcer, food. We'll condition the second operant with a secondary reinforcer, money. Let's watch and see who performs the behavior more. Now, let's see how operant 1 performs when she's rewarded with a primary reinforcer.
I'm full.
Now, let's see how operant 2 performs when she's rewarded with a secondary reinforcer. Notice how she doesn't add it's a 50. Notice how she doesn't reach a coupon for 1 round of Glow Golf. Notice how she doesn't reach a point of satiation nearly as quick. I don't think there's anything on there. As quickly as operant 1. I don't know. To wrap this video up, let's explain how both of these concepts apply to gambling. In this case, we'll use a slot machine as an example, because I believe it offers the clearest parallels. For those of you who don't know, a slot machine is a machine that looks something like this. You'll insert money to get a chance to pull this lever. When you pull this lever, random symbols will appear on the screen. If you get usually a match of symbols or anything that the machine deems as a recognizable pattern, the machine will give you the money that it's designated that symbol is rewarded with. Slot machines vary in their specifics, but they follow those general rules and 2 other rules that put the odds in the house's favor. The first rule is that the results for each round are random. The second rule is that the payout for any pattern is less than the odds of reaching that pattern. That means that statistically speaking, odds are you will lose more money in your attempt to get that pattern than you'll win from finally getting that pattern. The gambler's fallacy is one of the biggest factors contributing to the success of the slot machine in casinos. The gambler's fallacy has led many people to believe that if they can, or every time they lose, the odds of them winning the next round just get bigger and bigger. That's because those people forget about the first rule of slot machines. The result for each round is random, and they also forget the guiding principle of the gambler's fallacy. The results of past actions do not affect future results. No matter how much you've won or lost in the rounds before, every time you pull that lever, your odds are the same. Slot machines also use operant conditioning to condition gamblers to continue playing. They use secondary reinforcers such as bright lights, fun music, and biggest of all, money, to ensure that gamblers do not reach a satiation point from their winnings. They also use a variable ratio schedule of reinforcement, reinforcing you with a win after a random amount of plays to ensure that you keep pumping in quarter after quarter and that you are further resistant to extinction, or that you further resist the temptation to stop playing after you haven't won for a while. Once again, I would briefly like to issue the disclaimer that conditioning and addiction are not the same thing. Addiction implies the loss of an ability to choose and is a much more serious issue. So, hopefully we all had fun and maybe even learned something along the way. I just hope that you remember these lessons next time you find yourself at the slot machines and think that the next pull will be your lucky one. Unless it is your lucky one and you win big. Then send some of that money my way, brother. Or sister. I don't care, man. For real, I don't even care if you've won at the slots. Just send me money. Please. Like, that operant too, she just took all my money. I don't know how I'm gonna afford a ride home. I don't. Cameraman, can you give me a ride? You're going. Can you give me a ride home? No? Oh, no, don't worry about it. It's fine. Don't.